In this lecture, we're going to discuss the ethical issues in conducting psychological or social science research. So most social sciences are guided by the American Psychological Association ethics codes, which applies to psychologists and other researchers, and also includes students as well. And this provides ethical standards for research, but also for therapy, teaching, administration, any of the roles that social scientists may find themselves in. And before research is conducted, all research has to be reviewed by what's called the Institutional Review Board. The argument is that major ethical issues in research can hurt the science itself. They can hurt careers. There can be career or financial penalties. So it's really important that we evaluate these things. So the Institutional Review Board is designed to protect human research participants. There's generally 5 members of various expertise, scientists, non-scientists. There's often a community member who's not affiliated with the institution. And what it can do is approve or reject or request modifications to research considering the perspectives of the institution and the researcher and the participants. We won't talk about this much. We'll focus on the IRB, but there's also an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, the IACUC, which is designed to protect the rights and welfare of animal subjects as well. So they tend to focus on things like the care and housing of animals. And so when the IRB and researchers are considering ethical implications, it's really a subjective evaluation of the risk-benefit ratio. So society and individuals benefit from information gained from research, but there could also be, and there could be costs when research is not done. But there is the potential for risk to participants. So the question is it worth it? So we make this, and the IRB in particular makes this subjective evaluation of the risk and benefits to individuals as well as society, and asks, is the benefit greater than the risk? If the risk outweighs the benefit, then they're not going to approve the research. If there's a really big potential for benefit, they may be more willing to put participants at risk. So if we think about something like the COVID vaccine, there was a really big potential benefit. And so they allowed some physical risk for those initial study participants because it could have such a huge impact in addressing a global pandemic. And so, the potential of having a major medical breakthrough will allow more risks, where if somebody wants to inject someone with something random just to see if they say something funny, there's not a big potential benefit. So they're going to be much less likely to allow some kind of physical risk for people. Another thing that the studies consider is, will the study produce, or the IRB considers, is will the study produce valid and interpretable results? So the investigator needs to use the highest standards of scientific excellence. It's not going to be worth putting participants at any kind of risk if the results are going to be completely uninterpretable. Okay, so there are multiple types of risks, but there's some risks that are part of everyday life. And so the question is, how much risk beyond the risk of everyday life is a study putting on participants? So physical injury, negative side effects from a treatment for depression or something like that. There's a risk for psychological injury, stress. There's also social risk, so embarrassment or something like that. And so we're under this ethical obligation to protect participants from all types of risk whenever possible. And so we kind of classify this as minimal risk or at risk. So minimal risk is harm or discomfort is not greater than that experienced in daily life or during routine physical or psychological tests. So basically minimal risk, you could experience that any day on a typical day. It's important to remember, though, that this differs across individuals, right? Some individuals may be very prone to stress, and so may view risks as greater than minimal. When harm is judged as greater than minimal, then researchers have the obligation to protect their subjects. So if they're putting their subjects at risk, they need to provide some kind of protections. So this kind of increases researchers' ethical obligation. So for example, if they're going to put participants in a stressful situation, well, it has to be really important, right? It needs to have really good justification, a lot of benefits to come out of it. And the researchers might need to do something like provide a therapist for them to talk to after the fact, or explore alternative methods that might have lower risk. Another big thing to consider that can help with social risk is confidentiality. So it's important to remember that confidential is not the same as anonymous. So when a study is collected anonymously, the researcher never collects any identifying information, does not know who their participants are. In contrast, most studies are confidential. What that means is they do collect that initial information, but remove any identifying information from the records because they don't keep people's names with their actual data. Typically what happens is they assign an ID number to each person, and then all of the data is identified with the ID number and the names are stored separately. So no individual person's results are reported. And so we generally report in terms of statistical averages instead. Okay, so test yourself. Think about, do you think that the researchers are putting participants at risks? So college students complete an adjective checklist to describe their current mood. The researcher seeks to identify depressed students so they can be included in a study that examines cognitive deficits associated with depression. So the question is completing an adjective checklist to describe their current mood putting them at risk? I would say no, they're already thinking about these things, right? We're assessing what their current risk is. Here's another one. Students in a research methods class sees another student enter their classroom in the middle of a class period, speak loudly and angrily with the instructor, and then leave. As part of a study on the eyewitness behavior, students are asked to describe the intruder. So do you think that having someone come in and yell at your instructor would put you as a participant at greater risk? You know, the IRB might say, yes, it's certainly more stressful than normal, especially if there has been, you know, an incident recently or something like that. It could be quite alarming. Okay, so another important aspect is informed consent. And so informed consent is a social contract between the researcher and the participants. And basically, the participant explicitly expresses their willingness to participate in the research project because they have been giving a clear understanding of the research and the consequences for participating or not. So what the researchers do is tell the participants, here's exactly what I am planning to do. Here's a reason you might want to participate or you might not. So they have a clear understanding of the potential risk. And they're allowed to withdraw without penalty. And consent should really be given freely without inducement or pressure. And they need to, again, understand that they can withdraw without penalty. So this is a really crucial part of research. It's essential that your participants have given informed consent. They understand the risks and have chosen to participate, but they know they can change their mind. Some groups are unable to provide consent. In particular, two big groups, young children and the mentally impaired, have limited capacity to understand exactly what's going on. So if you're studying those groups, you get consent from a legal guardian instead, but you also from the participant need what's called assent, which is an indication that they do want to participate. So for example, if you're studying kids, the parent signs the consent form, brings the kid to the lab, the kid gets there and just throws an all-out tantrum and refuses to do anything. They have not given their assent, right? The kid clearly doesn't want to do it. You can't force them. So there's a number of issues with informed consent, and one of the big ones is a lot of studies are being done online now. So does a click, is that equivalent to a signature? Does it show that they've actually read it? I think the current state is that, you know, we've all agreed because online research is so prevalent now that has become accepted. But, you know, you can think about how well you read the terms of use for something, and that could affect how informed participants actually are. It's also important to not put undue pressure on participants to participate. So for example, they used to require that intro to psych students at major universities participate in a study in order to pass the class. Now they have to provide alternative assignments. Paying college students is generally acceptable, whereas paying like homeless people or prisoners, people that really may be very heavily influenced by those things is a little more questionable. So there are, for example, separate IRB committees and separate things you need to do if you're going to do research on prisoners, which are considered another vulnerable population, because they may be under other pressures. Okay, now you don't need informed consent when you're looking at public behaviors. So privacy is the right of the individual to decide how information about them is communicated. And we do want to respect people's privacy, but if you're doing the behavior in public, it's generally considered acceptable. So if you're counting like the frequency of same-sex information or interactions in a store, you don't need consent because you're looking at publicly available behavior. You're not collecting any personal information. If you are collecting identifying information about specific people, you do need consent. But sometimes it gets kind of hard to determine what's public behavior versus private behavior. Some of the things included involve the sensitivity of information, the setting. So even when we're in a public setting, people sometimes have a certain amount of expectation of privacy, right? Like you see people picking their nose in their car. Even though they're technically in public, they expect to be in private. Dissemination of information is really important too. So if you are providing a detailed description and an identifiable description of someone, you absolutely need their consent. But if you are describing group averages and not collecting any information about individuals, it's less essential that you get this consent. But again, the IRB will evaluate all of those things. Okay. Another major issue in psychological research is the issue of deception. So sometimes if we tell participants exactly what we're studying, sometimes they may behave in socially desirable ways. They might tell us what they think we want to hear rather than what they would actually do. So sometimes we have to use deception. So one form of that is omission, where we withhold some information from participants. We give them some, but we don't tell them everything. So we say we're studying, feeling blue, but really we're studying clinical depression. Commission is intentionally misinforming participants. So we say we're studying self-esteem when we're really studying, depression. So deception for the purpose of getting people to participate is always unethical. You can't tell people that they're going to do nothing that will cause them physical harm and then, shock them or something like that. That really contradicts informed consent. But sometimes some levels of deception are necessary for psychological research. So some of the pros are it allows us to study people's natural behavior, and it also allows us to study behaviors that we maybe couldn't without deception. The cons, though, is it contradicts informed consent. Also, we run the risk where if we deceive people in every single study, it may lead them to be suspicious of all of our research projects. It can potentially harm the relationship between participants and the researcher. So the general APA guidelines are that deception is only justified when the study is very important. Okay, we don't just deceive people for fun. If it really significantly contributes to the scientific knowledge. If no other methods are available, we cannot do this in a deception-free way. And then finally, if deception would not influence the decision to participate. So this is kind of the question of how much deception. And so we need to kind of consider that. Okay, finally, if we do deceive people, then we need to kind of tell people about this after the fact. So this is the process of debriefing. where we tell participants after they've done the study about the rationale for the research, about why we had to deceive them, about the importance of their contribution. So this is really done out of respect for the participants. We want to kind of tell them what we were doing and why. It's particularly important, though, if we use deception. So we clarify any misconception. We remove any harmful effects. So we check in on them and say, are you still feeling okay? Do you need any resources? Things like that. And we give them opportunities to learn more about the research or the study that was done. And we can also kind of get them to get experience or get feedback from their perspective. So generally the goal is to, during this debriefing, leave participants with a positive feeling. They feel like they significantly contributed to the scientific research, and that's a good thing. Okay, so we've done our study. There's also a whole set of ethical guidelines about how we publish psychological research. So publishing is how we formally report results to the scientific community, and how we enhance the researcher and the institution, and it can enhance the researcher and the institutional reputation. And so often a lot of people participate in one publication. And so the question is, who gets credit? And listing someone as an author, you want to acknowledge the people who made a significant contribution to the project. And generally, it's based on scholarly contribution, so not just time and energy. So I've worked in labs where we've had a lot of students working to collect data, but unless those students came and said, hey, this is a theoretical question I have, I want to run these analyses and I want to write it up. If all they were doing was just surveying people, they didn't get publication credit. So a lot of these issues kind of come from a faculty mentor potentially not giving a student credit, or giving student credit who didn't actually contribute. These are the kinds of ethical issues that come with publishing research. Another big issue is plagiarism. Plagiarism is presenting another's idea or work without clearly identifying the source. And so you don't want to present other people's work as your own. And it's really about getting the balance between getting credit for the ideas that are yours and that are new, but also you need to recognize other people's ideas. So combining ideas from two authors in a new way, I need to get credit for the combination, but I need to give them credit for the initial ideas. So you want to cite your sources appropriately using APA formatting. When you take directly from a source, you need to use direct quotation. You need to use quotation marks and cite. As a general rule, really in APA, it's pretty rare that you use direct quotes. So you should practice paraphrasing and citing it in parenthetical citations. Cutting and pasting from the internet also counts as plagiarism. This is an example of a direct quote. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because you shouldn't be using direct quotes really in this class. But you can see they've got the words in quotes and the authors and the year and the page number. In this case, we've got the same information, but no citation and no quotation mark. Here's paraphrased material that has the correct citation. So they've put it in their own words, but they've cited the authors in the text. Okay, so finally, this is kind of the general steps for ethical decision making, and this is what you will use when you evaluate things for kind of an ethical guide. So kind of the first thing you need to do is find out the facts. So what are the basics of the study? What are they doing? Who are their participants? What's their plan? These will be all the things that are relevant for making a decision. Next, you want to identify the relevant ethical issues. What are potential problems? So this includes how much risk versus benefit is there? Has informed consent been included? Are there issues of privacy? Are there issues of confidentiality, deception, debriefing? When you are kind of assessing a study for this, I want you to make sure that you're using the correct terms that we've talked about. So using these terms and not just describing them. Next, decide what's at stake for all parties. How will it benefit or harm the participants? How will it benefit or harm the researchers, the institutions, and society? So really thinking about what are the pros and cons. And then next, identify alternative methods and procedures. So are there ways that this study could be done without some of the ethical issues that may have been in there? And thinking about the ethical implications of those alternative methods. And then when you're evaluating a study, I want you to kind of think about, if you were on an IRB, what action should be taken? Should the study be accepted? Should it be rejected? Should it be accepted, but then you make some recommendations? So as you're evaluating studies, I've probably given you the example of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And so you're going to go through and kind of look at each of these things. Think about, what are the basics of the study? What are the relevant ethical issues? What is at stake? What are potential alternative methods? And then if you were on an IRB, what would you do? Would you accept the study? And that is it.